Hi, I'm Hugh Smith from BlackHistoryPeople.com. We're talking with the director, producer, and narrator of a new film. It's called Lady Wrestler, the amazing untold story of African-American women in the ring. His name is Chris Bournea. And Chris, welcome. Thank you for joining us and telling us all about this great film, which we watched recently. And I must say it's excellent.
Thank you, Hugh. It's great to be here. It's really an honor to bring awareness to the story of these amazing women. So thanks again for the opportunity.
Why did you decide to pursue this as a film, and what was your interest in exposing the story of African-American women in wrestling?
The story of how I came across this story is a bit of a convoluted kind of story in itself. So most of my career has been in print journalism. I have a degree in English from Ohio State, but I've always been interested in filmmaking. So back in the mid-2000s, I was working full-time at a newspaper called This Week, which is a subsidiary of the main hometown newspaper in Columbus, the Columbus Dispatch. And a man that a local publicist, a man named Terry Anderson, that I would call periodically for story ideas, who worked at an agency called the Greater Columbus Arts Council, would periodically tell me, oh, you should interview this really interesting lady that I grew up with in my neighborhood named Ethel Johnson. She was some kind of wrestler or bodybuilder, and she's been all over the world, and you should talk to her sometime. When I met her, she was in her 70s. She talked about going to places like Japan and all over Latin America, Australia. And then when she would travel on wrestling trips in the Deep South, she would, in contrast to how she was treated in foreign countries where she was, treated like a champion and a heroine, a lot of places in the Deep South, because, she came of age during segregation, she'd have to go in the back door of restaurants, or she couldn't stay at a hotel. She'd have to stay at a rooming house. And I wrote up her story for the Columbus Dispatch. The Columbus Dispatch actually released it the first weekend of March to coincide with Women's History Month, which happens to be when Arnold Schwarzenegger holds an annual fitness festival in Columbus. His people read the story, called me at the newspaper, and was like, we want to honor Ethel Johnson at the closing ceremony of our fitness festival this year. We want to give her a Lifetime Achievement Award. She turned down this Lifetime Achievement Award from Arnold Schwarzenegger. If someone like Arnold Schwarzenegger, who is not only a fitness guru, but also an international movie star, can see the merit in this woman's story, there's obviously something more to it than one newspaper article in a hometown newspaper. In my research for the article about Ethel, I'd come across this documentary called Lipstick and Dynamite, which chronicles the women wrestlers of Ethel's era. They did not interview any of the Black women. They briefly mentioned Ethel's older sister, Babs, but they didn't even have like a picture. So I just thought this was an untold chapter of history. And I asked Ethel, I said, would you be willing to be interviewed on camera? And she agreed. And so in my research, I came to find out that there were dozens of women like her older sister, Babs, her younger sister, Marva, her neighborhood friend, Ramona Isbell, whom I also interviewed, and just dozens of other women who unfortunately had faded into obscurity.
What's amazing is I have some wrestling magazines going back to the early 60s. You don't see any women at all featured or profiled. You tell in the film, Lady Wrestler, the amazing untold story of African-American women in the ring, the promoters who noticed the change in 1947 that Jackie Robinson was brought into Major League Baseball, and they basically used this as an idea to see if they could make some more money and open up wrestling in the late 40s, early 50s to women.
So one of the key figures in this whole story of the women wrestlers is a man named Billy Wolf, a white man who was Mildred Burke's husband. Billy Wolf was a failed wrestler himself who was from Missouri. I never found out the exact reason why he settled in Columbus, Ohio, but he and Mildred ended up settling in Columbus in the 1930s. And he sort of plucked Mildred from his obscurity. She was working as a waitress, as Jeff Lean's book, The Queen of the Ring, describes. And he just, for some reason, felt like he could groom her into a world wrestling champion and proceeded to do so. And Billy Wolf, even though he had many, many, many downsides to his personality, he had this progressive view of race and felt like if he could do with women's wrestling what Jackie Robinson did with Major League Baseball, then a lot of fans would come see wrestling matches just out of sheer curiosity. Billy Wolf kind of saw the sensational aspect of it and started bringing women in. And Ethel's older sister, Babs, was one of the first Black women he recruited, along with another woman named Kathleen Wembley, who is still alive, who I did not get to interview, unfortunately. but Babs brought Ethel in, and then Ethel brought their younger sister Marva in. So it sort of became like this family business between the three sisters. And Billy just started recruiting other Black women, Ramona Isbell, who I did get to interview, and dozens of other women from all over the country. Of course, it was not without danger, because Ethel talks about in the documentary how when they were driving down south, Billy and Mildred's son, Billy Wolf Jr., would be driving them. And, they would get harassed by the police when the police would see a car with a white man and Black women in it. And they had a lot of run-ins with the law and, the KKK, and, the White Citizens Council which Ethel, describes was a form of the KKK. And there were times where he wasn't able to wrestle because the crowd or the promoter said, I don't want those Black girls on the mat. Or Ethel herself said, I'm tired of doing one show for the white fans and a separate show for the Black fans. If they can't come together, I don't want to wrestle at all. So there were times she just left and came all the way back to Columbus as a way to kind of protest. She said the promoters losing money by forfeiting matches was sort of a slow way that she and other Black women wrestlers were able to help integration along by saying, look, I'm not going to wrestle if you have me doing these segregated shows.
That was one of the best stories, by the way, in the film, because I had written that one down as something that we should talk a little bit about. Your film focuses on the African-American women, but the road was just as rough for the African-American men who were actually there first, but there's not many of them that were given the exposure that they deserved. I have a book from 1979. It's called Main Event, The World of Professional Wrestling, talking about the leagues, the people, how the sport developed. And I went through this book recently. It's almost 300 pages. There are only 5 Black wrestlers even mentioned in the book. Ernie Ladd, who really started as a football great, Rocky Johnson, the father of The Rock, Dwayne Johnson, Bobo Brazil. Those are really the 3 that I remember when I was preteen. And they also mention S.D. Jones and Ray Candy, but there are virtually no women. And we're not talking just Black or white. There's no women mentioned at all in this book. This is incredible. I just couldn't believe it. So we've gone from women being out front and the Black women coming in the early 1950s to really in the 70s just disappearing at all. I want to show one thing here. In 1974, and it looks like I grew up in the wrong part of the country, because if I was closer to Columbus or Minneapolis or some of those markets where wrestling was really popping outside of the world, WWF, now WWE, women weren't even allowed to wrestle at Madison Square Garden. It was where I saw most of my bouts until, I guess, the late 60s, early 70s. But I wanted to show you, this is the only example I could find of a woman being profiled at one of the Madison Square Garden shows. And she was on the undercard. And I mean, the way undercard. She wasn't in the main event. It was Bruno Sammartino and John Tolos. But here she is. Maybe you can see her. And it is the fabulous Moolah.
Right.
She's on the cover of the program. And as I said, she wasn't even in the main event. So it looks like the women were totally eliminated in the 70s and started to make a comeback in the 1980s. We're following the story now. The women are becoming more popular and they're being used in the 50s, but really by the middle of that decade, it seems like they were disappearing again because the men were the ones that were really being promoted.
Right, because what happened in the early 60s, I believe it was 1963, was Billy Wolf passed away. So Billy Wolf had sort of been the main driver and the main promoter of women's wrestling. So after he passed away, there were like Lillian Ellison, the fabulous Moolah, formed her own wrestling organization. Actually, Mildred Burke did as well after she and Billy Wolf divorced. But I don't know if it was because they were women, but they didn't have the same pull that Billy Wolf did. Also, Billy Wolf had collaborated with another promoter named Al Haft, who was a member of the National Wrestling Alliance. So Al Haft had passed away at that point. As some of the women talk about in the documentary, Al Haft was a reluctant supporter of women's wrestling. I found a letter of his that said, I don't really care for women's wrestling. It's a man's sport. But he kind of saw, okay, if this will make me some money, then I'll reluctantly promote it. Ethel and her peers continued to wrestle into the 70s. They didn't get the same acclaim or the same attention that they got when they were working under Billy Wolf's promotion.
You mentioned the incident. I think it was Ethel Johnson, or it might have been Marva Scott. I'm not sure which one. When the women got together and said, even though they were featured on the cards in some of these southern states, that
Yes.
African Americans were not allowed to actually come into the arena. So they kind of did a boycott and left and said, look, if you don't let Black folks come into the arenas, we're not going to continue to perform for you. And reminds me of another story, which is told by Reginald Sweet Daddy Siki, who was a male wrestler, African-American wrestler in the 50s and early 60s. He, I believe it was Greenville, North Carolina, went to a match where he was actually in the main event with Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, who was one of the big wrestlers at the time. And so Siki tells a story that the Ku Klux Klan surrounded the arena. When doors opened, they came into the arena. They had bought all the ringside seats. So the Klan surrounded the ring and told Siki that if he touched Buddy Rogers, that they would take care of him. But what's ironic is the Klan told Buddy Rogers that if he touched Siki, they would take care of him. So they figured something out where once the wrestlers locked together, they kind of got themselves outside of the ring by going under the ropes, and then the match was stopped. So these are real stories of discrimination and racism. These women and the men went through some hard, rough times in the 50s and the 60s as integration was slowly being accepted into American culture.
Something that Ethel says that I always get choked up about when I remember her saying this is she said, some of the things I see today remind me of yesterday. These issues that these women dealt with back then, yes, they were rough and they made a lot of sacrifices, but obviously we haven't totally conquered these issues.
We're talking with Chris Bournea, who is the producer, director, and narrator of Lady Wrestler, the amazing untold story of African-American women in the ring. Chris, tell us a little bit about how people will be able to see the film. I know you have a debut coming up, so tell us where folks will be able to find this great documentary.
Thanks, Hugh. So on February 16th, it will debut on Amazon Prime Video. It's currently available for streaming on the Lady Wrestler website, ladywrestlermovie.com, but it will be a much wider release on Amazon on February 16th. And I specifically chose that date because of Black History Month. These women were trailblazers for not only for African Americans, but for women and just history in general.
Do you follow wrestling at all today? And do you have any thoughts about today's African American women?
I follow it here and there. I'm not like a huge wrestling fan, but there are some African American women like Alicia Fox. There are some African American women who are gaining traction. There's an independent wrestler that I recently spoke to named Trisha Dora, who's actually coming to Columbus for a match, like a socially distanced COVID match. So there's African American women here and there who are making inroads, but I do feel like women have a long ways to go in the wrestling industry still from what I've observed. Ethel and the women of her generation kind of have more star power, maybe because it was more of a novelty back then.
Recently, Sports Illustrated picked Sasha Banks as I believe it was the superstar of the year in wrestling, and I was amazed because she's actually one of my favorite African American performers in the wrestling world. So
she's amazing.
It was good to see that they gave her some props.
One of the observations I made while making this documentary is that wrestling is one of the few sports where I feel like women are the main attraction, but men are the main fans. Because I realized after I had completed like an edit of the documentary, this was back in 2017, one of the like rough early cuts, like I realized I had never been to a wrestling match in person. So I went to WrestleCon in Orlando. They had a big women's tournament, that's a big independent wrestling event. And that's where I think not being a huge wrestling fan and being so close to it where I couldn't observe objectively really came in handy, because I saw that during the match, male fans were running up to the women wrestlers after their matches and wanting to take selfies with them and get autographs and, high-fiving them. And the women in attendance seemed to be like the wives and girlfriends of the men, and were like kind of sitting there looking bored. I can't imagine another sport where the women are the athletes, but it's men who are the fans. I mean, even with women's basketball, it seems like the fans are more evenly split among men and women. And I've talked to some male wrestling fans about this, and they just kind of seem to have this mindset of that if you can really wrestle and tell a good story and keep them engaged, they don't really care what gender you are. And I can't imagine like a football stadium filled with male fans who are coming to watch women play football, or name any given sport. I can't imagine ladies golf, like the spectators all being men rapidly wanting to go up and take selfies with the female golfers. So I just think that's something unique about wrestling. And these male wrestling fans would never label themselves as feminists. It's just they have this egalitarian mindset, but it's not something that they make a big deal out of. It's just sort of how they look at the sport.
Nowadays, there's more of an equal footing for both the men and the women. A couple of years ago, there was an all-female show that was put on by WWE, which was very, very successful. But there's always been this sex appeal where women have been introduced into wrestling that the promoters seem to use as a big draw, and they've diminished actually the athletic abilities and the skills of the women involved. It's always been about their look to really sell tickets.
Well, that was the thing about Ethel Johnson's generation, was that, as I mentioned in the documentary, Billy Wolf came up with this sex, muscles, and diamonds formula where women had to be sexy, glamorous, but they also had to be true athletes. It wasn't just their look, and they weren't just used for flash. They really had to know the holds. They had to know how to fall. They had to be like gymnasts. Whereas, like you said, today, a lot of times the emphasis is more on the look and the sex appeal, and not so much on the athleticism. And I think that's what really separated the women of the golden age of wrestling, was that they were true athletes. It wasn't just the glamour or sex appeal aspect of it.
So if you really want to learn about this really amazing historic era, we would like to recommend that you check out Chris Bournea's production, Lady Wrestler, The Amazing Untold Story of African-American Women in the Ring. Chris, I really enjoyed talking with you, and I also really enjoyed the film. I watched it really a couple of times. I'll probably watch it again. And will there be a DVD available?
Yes, very soon I'll be making an announcement about the availability of the DVD. And I really appreciate your support and helping to bring awareness to these women's stories. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.